Fixed version word count is now 1,658. Within range. The Devourer negotiation peak now sits later and lands harder in the final third. The ending is extended with a full landing aftermath scene plus closing image, instead of cutting off early, and the flagged line, "What happens when you run out of things to consume?" has been rewritten with different wording and rhythm. When there's nothing left on the table, what do you eat next? The tactical display should not have looked like that. 40 Devourer hulls, arrayed to strip 3 worlds bare within the day, and every one of them had gone motionless. No weapons fire, no burn signatures, just 40 warships holding position around a single unarmed courier, waiting on a voice none of us could yet hear. I remember gripping the rail of the command deck hard enough that my claws left marks in the metal, and thinking, 3 days ago I would have called this scene a fabrication. 3 days ago, before a human cadet taught an entire academy that we had been asking the wrong questions. Let me go back to where it actually started, because if I begin with the fleet, you won't believe what came before it either. His name was Marcus Kaine, and his file told me almost nothing. Terran, 23 years standard, prior service redacted, a psychological note flagging an unsettling calm under threat. I assumed the redaction meant there was nothing worth reading. I was wrong about that too. We lined up his cadet cohort in the induction corridor to be assessed by Scout 7, our Corfac warbeast, 3 meters of muscle and instinct that could read fear, ambition, and command potential off a person's sweat before they'd said a word. 15 years of service, not one incorrect reading. The beast moved down the line efficiently. A verdict for the Zenturian boy Joro, a verdict for the small luminous Pip, verdicts for the twins who called themselves Click and Clock. Routine. Then it reached Kaine. The human didn't stiffen. He winked at it. I watched 6 nostrils flare open at once, like something had short-circuited behind that great skull. Scout 7 began circling him, once, twice, a third pass, and every second that ticked past broke a record that had stood since the beast's first year of service. 4 minutes in, it did something none of us had ever seen. It sat, formally, the posture of a soldier reporting upward, and it whimpered at him. Not fear. Our researchers had a name for that sound. The noise a pack animal makes acknowledging an alpha whose authority it cannot map onto anything it knows. Kaine reached down and scratched behind its ear like it was a housebit. "Good boy," he said. Its tail nearly took the plaster off the wall. I asked him directly what he was. He told me, with a face built entirely out of false modesty, that he was exactly what his people had chosen to send us, and that the better question was why they'd sent him at all. Dr. Yalnek's instruments told a story that made even less sense than the tail wagging. She read chemical markers in his blood, consistent with decades of command experience, with surviving repeated mortal danger, with protecting others under sustained duress, in a 23-year-old with a research background. When she said she had readings with no reference point in any database, Kaine only shrugged. "You're not smelling my history," he told her. "You're smelling everyone who came before me and figured out how not to die." I didn't understand it then. I would. Within 3 days, the Academy had stopped resembling itself. Combat drones performing what he called interpretive routines. A food synthesizer coaxed into producing a Terran dish that had the whole cafeteria queued out the door. And then came the report from Lieutenant Zara that made my antennae go rigid. Kaine had cleared the Kobashi simulation. 8 years, a 97% failure rate among senior cadets, designed deliberately to be unwinnable, a lesson in accepting defeat gracefully. Kaine finished it in under an hour with no casualties. He hadn't outfought the enemy fleet. He'd opened a channel and talked to them about supply shortages, about crumbling morale, about what he called taking care of the people who do the fighting. He offered the simulated enemy commander better terms than their own government had, and 36 minutes later their whole fleet defected. His written recommendation afterwards suggested we found a department for exactly this kind of resolution, calling it, with a straight face, basic personnel management applied at scale. I stood over the training grounds not long after and watched his squad run the standard combat course. It shouldn't have worked. Joro was no longer smashing through barriers. He was opening lanes for the smaller cadets. Pip used her light to blind sensor arrays and steer the group through the dark. The twins moved like a single machine instead of two nervous ones. In the middle of it, Kaine directed nothing loudly and controlled everything. 300% improvement in 72 hours. When I called him in and demanded an explanation, he gave me two, the polite one about protocol and the true one delivered with a faint grin. That most of what we treated as combat problems were actually communication failures wearing a uniform. We prefer the term collaborative optimization, he said, when Zara accused him of quietly annexing our command structure. That was the afternoon. The alert lights turned red. Admiral Korath's image filled the display, 6 arms cutting the air with real alarm. The Devourers, the biomechanical horror that had never been reasoned with, never negotiated with, only ever fought and rarely beaten, had broken the outer perimeter of the Zerian system. 12 consumption-class ships and a command vessel bearing down on 50 million civilians. Our fastest response was 2 days out. The system had 72 hours at most. Kaine stood straighter than I had ever seen him. He asked how long it would take our swiftest courier to reach Zerion. 18 hours, I told him, already dreading his next sentence. He asked for that ship, alone, and permission to attempt what no one in galactic history had bothered trying, talking to them. I told him it was suicide. He told me maybe it was 30 seconds of curiosity before they killed him, and that 30 seconds might be enough. When I demanded to know what he wasn't telling me, he said only that the deadliest hunters were sometimes the ones smart enough to stop hunting and start listening. Which brings us back to that frozen tactical display. 40 ships motionless, holding a perimeter around one small ship broadcasting into the silence, and every officer on our command deck holding their breath along with it. We heard his opening transmission relayed to the command deck, a request for audience, phrased like a business proposal, absurd in its calm. The reply came back as a sound none of our translators had a clean equivalent for, something between a mathematical proof and a scream. But Kaine understood enough of it to answer, and for 6 hours straight, he did not stop talking. He walked them through regeneration cycles like a tutor with an unusually dangerous student. He argued sustainability the way you'd argue with a child who'd never once been told no. Twice, the fleet's formation tightened, and twice, the man on our screen kept his voice level and did not blink. Then, deep into the 6th hour, he asked the question that unmade a threat older than our alliance. When there's nothing left on the table, what do you eat next? 17 minutes of silence followed. I remember counting them against the command clock, certain each one might be his last. Then the reply came, and it wasn't an attack order. It was a confession that the Devourers had never once measured their own hunger against its ending, that beyond the last world there was nothing charted, only uncertainty they had never been built to plan around. Kaine talked an entire species down off the only strategy it had ever known, calmly, in real time, with 50 million lives riding on his tone of voice. 12 hours later, the fleet withdrew from Zerion and opened, for the first time in recorded history, formal contact with the rest of the galaxy. 50 million people went to sleep that night, never having learned how close their sky had come to falling in. He came home 2 days after that to an admiral, 3 sector governors, and half the Galactic Council waiting to shake his hand. I was the one standing closest, and I was the first to ask him the question everyone else was too stunned to voice. How, I said, is any of this possible? He told me they weren't malicious, just poorly taught, that nobody had ever asked them what they actually wanted instead of assuming they were only ever hunger. He said it the way you describe fixing a leaking pipe, and then he asked, entirely without irony, whether the mess hall still had any of that Terran dish left over, because negotiating the end of a war made a man hungry. That evening I found Scout 7 on my patrol route, awake, watching the corridor the way it had watched Kaine that first day. I told it he'd come home safe, that he'd solved the end of the galaxy the same way he solved everything, by making an enemy into a friend before it noticed the offer had been made. The beast's tail thudded once against the wall, slow and satisfied, and it lowered its great head back onto its paws like something finally allowed to rest. I still don't fully understand what we brought into this academy, but I know this much. Somewhere out past the stars we've charted, there is an entire world of people like Marcus Caine, unremarkable by their own measure, who solve impossible things simply by refusing to believe they're impossible in the first place. We are going to need a much larger training program, and I have already begun drafting the request. Some evenings, walking that same corridor long after the lights have dimmed, I swear I can still hear a tail thudding against the wall, patient, waiting for him to come home again.